All right, well, thanks everybody to those of you who have joined us here in person, despite the beautiful weather in New York, and thanks to those of you who have joined us online. We're delighted to welcome Daniel Satinsky here to the Jordan Center today. My name is Joshua Tucker. I'm the professor of political science here at NYU, and I'm the director of the Jordan Center. Daniel is a business consultant, author, and attorney. He participated in Soviet-era joint ventures and then business projects in Russia until 2014. Since 2014, he's been writing about the historic transformation of the Soviet Union into post-Soviet Russia based on his experience, research, and interviews. He's the author of Hammer and Silicon, the Soviet Diaspora and the US Innovation Economy, 2018. He holds a Master of Law and Diplomacy from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts and a JD from the Northeastern University Law School. Currently, he's a non-faculty associate of the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. Those of you who are on Zoom, if you have questions, you can use the raised hand feature, and we can call on you to do that. Those of you in the room can actually use your hand if you want to ask a question. But as someone who spent time in Moscow in Russia in the 1990s when I was in graduate school, I'm super excited to hear about the insights, and we were just chatting beforehand about all the kind of interview work that's gone into this, and I think Daniel's going to bring a sort of different perspective from many of the talks that we get here, given his first-person insertion and all the people he's gone back and talked to since then. So Daniel, thanks so much for being here today.
Great. Thank you, Joshua. Thanks to the Jordan Center for giving me the opportunity to present this book, which is Creating the Post-Soviet Russian Market Economy Through American Eyes. The book really presents a slice of the life of Russia during the 80s and 90s, well, Soviet Union and then Russia, and it's a partial picture of the most intensive personal interaction of Americans and Russians in history, most extensive interaction in history. So my fundamental thesis for today, and part of the reason for writing the book, is that examining the 1950s and the interaction of Americans and Russians, it yields insights for the present and raises important questions for the study of Russia going forward. So today I'm going to speak some about the interviews, I'm going to speak some about some analysis, I'm going to speak some about some theses. So the question is, why did I write this book? Well, the original purpose was to preserve this historically unique period of time through the eyes of people who lived through it. And I was one of those people, as indicated by the pictures here, were some of my travels through Russia, the top one being board of directors meeting of the telecom joint venture Rustel in Rome, and below right is a trip to Yakutia and a shaman reading my spirit, I think, through her hand. I'm not sure exactly what she was reading, but and then Tomsk in the middle of winter with a Chekhov statue, although most of you know Chekhov was never in Tomsk. But this was, for those of us who were active then, it was a sense of we were part of a history and a historic change. And this historic change has not been very well documented or appreciated. So this was the original purpose for the book. I thought that I would interview 25 or 30 people. As soon as I started, mostly through people I knew through my connections I had been the director of the U.S.-Russia Chamber of Commerce of New England and knew people who were active in business in a lot of different spheres. So I started with the idea I would interview 25 or 30 of them. Most of them were so enthusiastic about this idea. Oh no, you have to interview so-and-so. So this list grew through this kind of network approach to interview 105 people. Due to the expanse of this, one of my first tasks was how to limit this, how to focus this book. I also had to focus because the publisher wasn't going to let me I wanted. So I had a page limit as well. So what I ended up doing was focusing only on Americans, and that's not a full picture of what was going on in Russia at that time because of the importance of Europeans, Japanese, Koreans, Indian, other people who were active in business at the time. And I also decided to focus it primarily on the new sectors of the economy, those that did not exist in the Soviet times, and I'll explain that in a minute. But the other thing I found is that talking to people, they by and large were not analytic. People talked about their experiences, they told stories, they told how they built businesses or how they carried out programs, and it fell to me to try and establish an organizing framework for the information from these, which is partly what I want to talk about first before we get into the meat of the interviews themselves. So I'll just say briefly that, you know, there are some overarching themes that I just want to leave you with, which is relations in the 1980s and 1990s. It wasn't just at the top level of political leaders or ambassadors. I want to question some commonly accepted assumptions about the 1990s based on the information that I've collected through these interviews. And I want to say a few words about the relevance of the 1990s to the present and to the future of Russian studies. Okay, so part of the complexity is my first theme is that there was a shifting frames of reference by Americans and Russians, and vastly different points of view about the common experience that they were going through. And I think at least in the beginning, the American view was pretty much summarized by the quote I have here from Brzezinski, that basically Russia was in receivership to the West. And initially, there was a lot of that attitude from foreign business people and government officials that sort of the Cold War had been lost, we won, the values of liberal democracy had triumphed, and the changes in Russia were forever. On the other side, Russia, and I think there are differences between different Russians, but the reformers around Yeltsin had a romanticism with the market, but never saw themselves as in receivership. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. But that they were, in a sense, and not consciously or unconsciously, repeating a pattern of modernization throughout Russia, first begun by Peter the Great, who invited foreign experts to come and modernize Tsarist Russia. Later, Stalin also drew on Westerners, including American industrialists, to help industrialize Russia in the 20s. And they were following on the same process of reaching out to the West for modernization, which is not the same as receivership. Later, in the US developed, and I think it was Goldman Sachs developed this concept of BRICS, of the emerging markets, and Russia became an emerging market, a place for investment, a place for development and integration into the world system dominated by the Western powers. And now we see a complete rejection of that model by the Russians. And the quote here is from a recent study by the Higher School of Economics. While it's not Russian foreign policy officially, it is a strong trend in Russian foreign policy to see that Russia is not only not integrated, but as a direct opponent of the world created by the West. So again, on the complexity, I just want to elaborate on a bit on these points of difference. And actually here, the most important thing is to understand where we were in the 1990s. What the difference in the transformation from the Soviet Union to Russia. And keeping in mind that there was no private property in the Soviet Union. You did not own your apartment. You did not own your land, even if you had some rights to it. And private business was illegal. Finance did not exist in the way we know it. Banks were a part of the planned economy as a set of inputs into a broader centrally planned economy. And so this was a starting point for these changes. Again, on the US side, the fact that the Soviets had failed was validation of liberal democracy and in some circles, the end of history. And for Russians, it was a starting point for modernization of their country as still a great power. So I want to add a little more complexity to the story by starting actually in the 1980s. I don't think it's possible to understand the 1980s without understanding the citizen diplomacy movement that began in the 1980s. And this, again, is a movement that's little studied, little written about. It's pieces here and there. But it was the beginning of the interchange between Russians and Americans, which expanded exponentially in the 1990s, sometimes with the same organizations and the same people playing critical roles in that expansion. So let me talk to you a little bit about citizen diplomacy. I don't know how much any of you know about it, but in the 1980s was the beginnings of these personal interactions between Americans and Russians. On the American side, there was a fear of nuclear war. People were definitely and genuinely afraid that there would be a nuclear interchange between the two countries. On the US side, there was a feeling that if the people of each country could talk to each other, then we would be able to prevent a nuclear exchange. And on the sort of edges of society, these contacts began. And I say edges because one of the first centers for Soviet American exchange was the Esalen Institute, which was a study of the human potential movement and a realization on their part that the Soviet scientists were also interested in some of the same things of parapsychology, of auras, of various aspects of, what would be considered new agey kind of stuff in the US and out of the mainstream. But in any event, the Esalen Institute sent Jim Hickman and a colleague of his to Tbilisi in 1979 for a conference on the problems of the unconscious. And this led to an ongoing exchange and later to the founding of the Soviet American Exchange Program. And this was mainly through the Russian Academy of Sciences and Esalen, but it later expanded into other exchanges. And this early part of the 1980s was foundational in the beginning of real contact between the peoples of the two countries. So in 1982, there was a rock and roll festival called the US Festival that Steve Wozniak of Apple was financing. And in sort of the unstructured environment of the day, they were brainstorming and they said, wouldn't it be really cool if we could use technology to link people in Russia to this festival? It would be because this space bridge or space technology had just been developed. So Hickman was just about to go to Moscow with Rusty Schweiker, an American astronaut, to talk about creation of an association of cosmonauts and astronauts. And so he was tasked by the US Festival to try and see if they could develop a link. And without going into all the details, which are in my book, they succeeded. And so on Labor Day in 1982, in the middle of the US Festival, on a big screen, suddenly appeared Russians in a studio in Moscow, and Russian bands waiting to play rock and roll music, and Russian students with beach balls and, paraphernalia. And this came on, and 15 minutes into the broadcast, Bill Graham, who was a famous rock and roll promoter, pulled the plug. He said, this is Soviet propaganda. They can't be in Moscow. This is in Washington, D.C., so they pulled it. So the Americans called Hickman, who was in Moscow, and said, Graham just pulled the plug. And he said, it doesn't matter. They don't know, so we won't tell them. So it just continued on, but it began a series of these kind of interchanges. There was a second US Festival, in which it was a much fuller exchange. And then there were a whole series of space bridges beginning in 1983. There was a famous one in 1986 that reached millions of viewers in the Soviet Union, and something less than millions, but a significant number of people in the US. This series of exchanges built to the point where in 1987, there was a space bridge discussion between members of the US Congress and the Supreme Soviet. And there were 6 episodes that were hosted by Peter Jennings on ABC News, with them exchanging views on things like the environment, pollution, world peace. Inconceivable to us now that such a thing could occur, but it did. And there was a genuine interest on the two sides in this. Another example of this was, of this kind of contact, was the Joel Schatz, who was a peace activist in San Francisco. He wrote to the Soviet embassy and said he wanted to come to Russia because his wife had a kid's coloring book that he wanted to get their involvement with for a peace promotion. He bought they sent him the visa. He bought a Radio Shack computer to take with him. He wasn't a computer guy. He took the Radio Shack with him. He was introduced to people in the Russian Academy of Sciences, and what they saw was, here's a guy with technology, and we can get some access to technology. Because on the Soviet side, they were well aware of their lagging behind the West in technology. So they seized on the Americans' interest in peace for their own interest in technology. And this later developed through Joel into a joint venture that had the very first email exchange between the US and Soviet Union. The first customers were the CIA and the FSB, and then later the news agencies. But I cite this as it's the beginning of these kinds of actual collaborations between Americans and Russians. And there's a picture here of in the slide of Jim Hickman with John Denver. John Denver was one of the first rock and rollers that toured Russia, and Hickman arranged it. And more importantly, there's the picture of Boris Yeltsin at Randall's grocery store. And this was an episode in which the Esalen Institute invited Yeltsin to come to the US He was supposed to be going to a Johnson, Texas meeting. They were driving along. He saw a grocery store rental, said, "Stop, pull over." So he goes into the grocery store, and this is him walking down the aisles of these grocery store, looking at all the produce and the products that were available. And he comes out and he accuses his handlers from Esalen of setting him up. This was a propaganda stop to show the superiority of America. So finally, they convinced him that it wasn't, that this was just an ordinary grocery store. And it was, I think, it's hard to say, whether it sort of crystallized something for him, how important it was, but it was important. And 2 years later, Yeltsin quit the Communist Party. And to a certain extent, it was his sense of how far behind they were that was shown to him personally by these kinds of exchanges. And the last thing I will say about this is that at the end of the Gorbachev period, Gorbachev wanted to modernize the Soviet economy, but keep it socialist. And so he allowed for joint ventures between Russian or Soviet entities and Americans. This picture here is at Trenmos Bistro, which was one of the first American restaurants in Moscow, which was one of these joint ventures. And it was Trenton, Moscow. It was a sister city relationship that the people in Trenton developed into this restaurant. And again, there's more about this in the book. Another important joint venture of this period was Perestroika, which was the first real estate joint venture, and I'll talk about that a bit in a moment. So again, complexity and intensity of this relationship between Americans and Russians intensified and accelerated with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the US responded with massive amounts of US aid and the utilization of the existing contacts with people and organizations from the citizen diplomacy period to help administer and expand these US aid programs. So in the early days of reform in the 1990s, the US government implemented 215 different programs from 23 different departments and individual agencies, the largest of which were AID, USDA, and DOD. And the USAID alone in the years from 1990 to 1994 spent $3.5 billion on programming in Russia and $10 billion in credits for various programs. And one of the interesting stories of that period was about the Peace Corps in Russia. Because Secretary of State Baker visited Yeltsin in December of 1991 as the Soviet Union was being dismantled and promised that he would send within a year 100 business people to help the transition, to build a private economy in Russia. And he went back to Washington and couldn't figure out how they were going to do this because none of the Commerce Department had no experience doing it. Nobody had any programs. So they put an ad in the Wall Street Journal for experienced business people to go to Russia to pick 100 of them. They got 25,000 replies. And within a year, they sent 100 Peace Corps volunteers to Russia. 50 of them went to the Lower Volga and 50 of them went to the Russian Far East. And it's really interesting stories about their experiences that I don't have time to go into in detail at this moment. But as an example of this, how the former peace organizations became aid organizations, there was an organization called Project Harmony, which was in, I believe, in New Hampshire. And it was called Project Harmony because it began with an exchange of kids' choirs. So it was, to build peace through understanding. So they became known for having contacts. And in 1992, police officers from Leominster, Fitchburg, and Medford, they're small Massachusetts cities, contacted Project Harmony to ask if they could set up an exchange with police in Russia. And this is the level of curiosity is amazing and interest in this transformation that took place. So they set up, Project Harmony set up a delegation of 30, including Massachusetts State Police and local police officers. They took with them gifts of armored vests, special batons, and a drug dog, and went off to Petrozavodsk in Karelia and established an exchange that went on for some number of years between the police officers in Massachusetts and the police officers in Petrozavodsk, back and forth between them. I cite this mainly to show the depth of the interaction that went way beyond just Moscow and St. Petersburg conferences or meetings. So getting to the meat of this story, for the people around Yeltsin, the key to the transformation they wanted to make in Russia was privatization. They believed that the only way to prevent a restoration of the Soviet Union and socialism was to privatize, and to privatize as fast as possible. Anatoly Chubais, who was head of the privatization office, described themselves as kamikazes. They only had a limited time to live. They had to accomplish their mission, and they were certain they would be replaced quickly. So they turned to foreign advisors to help them do this. The initiative was Russian, but the mechanics of how to carry it out came from foreign advisors. So there's a common, generally, assumption about this period that shock therapy was sort of forced on the Russians by Harvard and Jeffrey Sachs. It was a mistake, that it caused all kinds of damage, and a program for Harvard and Sachs personally. I think the truth is that the Russians initiated this, and they turned to Sachs and Harvard because they had existing relationships with Harvard. They needed their technical expertise. However, even Harvard wasn't enough. And one of the most important interviews I had was with Boris Jordan, who helped establish this center, who explained to me that Harvard didn't understand the practicalities of this process. And so there was a new tender for privatization expertise that Boris convinced the Credit Suisse to enter this competition by agreeing to carry out a privatization program for nothing, that they would not charge the Russian government anything. His view was that if they did this, they would come to know all the important people in Russia, that it was an investment in the future. At that moment, Credit Suisse, head of Eastern Europe, supported the idea. So Boris created a team that was under the protection of Chubais and created the privatization program that was, and the voucher program that was implemented. More on the sort of complexity and interaction of Americans and foreigners with Russians. As the Yeltsin reforms blossomed and the aid programs blossomed, at the same time, multinational corporations wanted to explore Russia, and adventurers and con men and all kinds of other people flooded in. And there was a large expat community created in Moscow and St. Petersburg mostly. I've never been able to get a definite estimate of how big it was. So everyone has different numbers ranging from 50,000 to 250,000, but it was significant. And the expats created their own institutions. There's a poster here for an NBA basketball exhibition match that was held on Red Square. There was the American Chamber of Commerce, which became very important as a voice for American business in Russia. The Moscow Times, again, important institution for the expat community. And as these expats began to develop there in Moscow, they created a demand for the kind of life and services that they had outside of Russia. So, for instance, I know when I first started going there, I couldn't go to any restaurants. Restaurants there was no fast food except for a place called Liban on Tverskaya that had kind of Lebanese food. And we used to go with a big suitcase full of macaroni and cheese and instant oatmeal and food because we couldn't navigate the restaurant system in Russia. But that changed very rapidly because of the critical mass of people, and I'll talk about that again in a minute. But I want to go back to sort of the main focus of this book was on sectors of the economy in which expats and Americans were of critical importance and which did not exist under the Soviet Union. There was a financial system in the Soviet Union, but it was nothing like a Western financial system. So it was starting from zero. The development of the Russian voucher system meant that there were shares being traded in Russian privatized enterprises. But that trade was chaotic, difficult, unpredictable, immature, all kinds of words that called out for a kind of a regularization and creation of a stock exchange. The Russian stock exchange was created by Americans who came to Russia with Fred Berliner, who was the key figure in this, had been a trader on Wall Street, saw an ad in the Wall Street Journal that there was a interest in someone who knew about trading to go to Russia. He responded to it, and he went off and set out to create the RTS, the first Russian stock exchange. He was supported in that by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. They got secondhand software from NASDAQ, I believe, and set up the first Russian stock exchange. Once the stock exchange was set up, it was a platform for more active trading in shares in Russian companies. And that led to the creation of banks like Troika Dialogue, and Renaissance Capital and United Financial Group. The share trading was mostly by foreigners who were aware of the undervaluation of Russian shares and wanted a way to get into the Russian economy, and they did it through the intermediaries of foreigners who set up investment banks who could access these shares. And Boris Jordan, to continue on, left Credit Suisse with his staff and founded Renaissance Capital. So he was one of those influential people, along with Troika Dialogue, which are generally sort of the leaders in this development of these investment banks. At the same time, there was some private equity companies that were formed. The first two were Russia Partners and Bering Vostok. Bering Vostok, and I think the private equity groups reached much even deeper into the Russian economy. They weren't just trading shares, they were actually seeking to reform Russian enterprises and change them internally. So, or to create absolutely new forms of business. So for instance, Russia Partners was a collaboration between Paine-Webber and the Russian Orthodox Church. The Russian Orthodox Church had been restored to its position of importance and was given back a number of churches and had no money and no ability to rehab those churches. So Paine-Webber went there and concluded an agreement with the Russian Orthodox Church that included Prime Minister Chernomyrdin and for the Russian government contributing funds into the first of the what became the Russia Partners funds. One of the first projects was the creation of Russian MTB, which they sold and made a lot of money on. And it's interesting if you think about now and the Russian Orthodox Church and its defense of morality and Russian values, that it was a partner in the creation of Russian MTB. Ultimately, Russia Partners had 4 different funds. They raised $1.5 billion and created about $10 billion in value from those investments. There was a time when people believed that these financial institutions, the stock exchange and private equity, would have the same role and importance in the economy as they did in Western economies. That, of course, has proven not to be the case, as Russian banks were the main economic institutions opposing them, and through the banks, the Russian government. And so, as it now is, the Russian banks and Russian government institutions have become the arbiters of where investment goes in Russia, not stock markets or private equity groups. And I think if we look at the Bill Browder case, it sort of illustrates this conflict in worldview. Another new area of the economy in Russia was real estate. As I said, there was no private property. One of the first things that Yeltsin did was to allow people to privatize their apartments. So for nothing, they could become owners of their own apartments. And at the same time, there were foreigners pouring into Moscow who didn't want to live in hotels. They were some of them are going to live there permanently, or at least not permanently, but for a period of time. They didn't have apartments, and so what arose were young Americans who had contacts with Russians and contacts with foreigners who became brokers for these privatized apartments and built brokerage businesses that grew into huge agencies, which were then absorbed by the international brokerages like CBRE, Colliers, Jones Lang LaSalle, purchased these businesses that had been created by young American entrepreneurs. There were also larger developers who came in, but in both residential and commercial areas, initially there was no office space. The only way you could get office space was through a subdivision of the foreign ministry, which allocated space. It was terrible space. Nobody wanted to be in it, and they had no alternative. Perestroika was the first joint venture that developed Western style space. They taught Russians how to develop it, what Western tastes were. what a lease was, what it meant to be a landlord and developer, until the point where they were no longer needed. The progression of photos here in the slide is from these very early brokerage by some people out of Boston, to this development of Pokrovsky Hills, which was a townhouse development by Heinz Company, and was specifically for foreigners. And then the last picture is of a mall in Yaroslavl, picture that I took in 2017, which is all Russian. And by this time, Russians had no particular need of foreigners. They had absorbed all the skills they needed from this experience in the West. Much the same with restaurants. The transformation was dramatic. The first picture of this formal restaurant is a Soviet restaurant. You had to have reservations in advance. It was a whole evening. Ordinary Russians wouldn't go there. It was morally decadent and too expensive. So it was really only for high officials or insiders. And as the foreigners began to demand changes, the ways in which Russians related to eating and going to restaurants changed dramatically. So you had interesting story, I guess, of a bunch of American entrepreneurs who were playing basketball at the American Embassy on Saturday nights. And they said, you know, it would be really great if after we played basketball, we had a Denny's we could go to. But there were no Denny's or anything like it. So they decided to found the Starlight Diner. And they brought a diner from the US and installed it there and served American food, partly because they knew there was a demand, that was something they wanted. And it then became a kind of helped transform the way Russians saw restaurants and dining. And so it was foreigners who brought fast food, pizza, sushi, but it also meant changes in supply chains, how warehousing, logistics, and transport. This is, I think, an important aspect of this interaction between Russians and foreigners was the penetration of US and Western culture and its impact on Russia. And this is an impact that Putin has been waging war on since at least since the sort of beginnings of the 2000s. But my book tells the story of many of these of activities, and I can see I'm kind of running out of time, but so I want to just highlight one thing, which is Cosmopolitan.
10 more minutes. We just want to make sure that people have time to ask questions.
Yeah, okay. So Cosmopolitan was launched in Russia in 1994 as a joint venture between the Moscow Times and Hearst Corporation. And at that time, the only women's magazines in Russia were Farm Woman and Factory Woman. And they founded this, and it became an instant sensation. So the editions of Cosmo in Russia ran to 800 pages, with 600 pages of those being ads. It helped create the ad industry. It transformed how young women saw themselves and their relationship to their families and spouses. There's stories of people banding together to get enough money to buy one of these when it came out, and then it get handed around from this whole group. But there was this real penetration of Western values into Russia in this period that it was important to understand it. And I don't have time to go into this in detail, but some of these things that I have explained to you of these transformations still exist in Russian life. They persist to this day. They have been Russified in that the McDonald's is not McDonald's, but the form of McDonald's is still the same. The fast food industry is owned by Russians, but it is still the fast food industry. And the Russian economy is not Soviet. It is a market economy, not the same as ours, but it is a market economy that was fundamentally transformed in the 1990s. And I think that it's important to keep these things in mind to understand Russia today. So I don't have enough time to do this in justice that I would like, but so I think that understanding the impact of the 90s is important to understand Russia going forward, that there is an impact from the Soviet Union that persists. And I think we were talking about this earlier. One of the things that persists is that the Soviet Union was a champion of the colonial world against the Western imperial powers. What Putin has done in transforming the rhetoric of the time is to now pose as the champion of the global South, which is the heritage of the Soviet Union. We need to, I think, understand that heritage and understand the swings in Russian history between Euro-centric and Asian-centric and the Eurasian-centric and the back and forth, and whether the current swing towards Eurasia is permanent, or at least permanent within our lifetime. And, lastly, I would say it's important that we have sources of information that get beneath the surface of events and people, despite the difficulties that we now have because of the lack of this access and exchange. We don't want to go back to the period of Sovietology where the way you understood the Soviet Union was who stood next to who on the May Day parade on standing on top of Lenin's tomb. We do not want to go back to that. So I would say to you that the repository of knowledge from the 1990s is an important contributing source to all of you who are continuing to study Russia and to pay attention to Russia. And the last thing, my last point is, why is it important? Because Russia is not going away. This was, this fact became obvious to me when I made a trip to the little city of Uglitch, which is in the northern part of the Yaroslavl Oblast. And riding into the city, there's a little sign that says Uglitch and the date in which it was established. Uglitch, a city of 15,000 people in rural Russia, was established in 937. And I've often thought about all the trials and tribulations that city and the people in it have witnessed, but it's still there. It is not going away. It is still there, and we will continue to make mistakes about evaluating Russia unless we sort of dig deeper into its history. We do not want to, if one of the things here on this slide is the cover of the Atlantic from May 2001, in which it says Russia is finished. There was a belief that Russia was no longer a great power, that Russia was going away. What my little experience in Uglitch and what everything we've seen since then is that's not the case, and we need to continue to have a more detailed and sophisticated understanding of Russia and its role in the world. So I'm a great, even in the face of its aggression against Ukraine, we need, I believe, to continue to have a serious investigation of Russia and the historical and political forces within it as we go forward. So I appreciate your time, and I'll take any questions that you would like.
Great, thank you so much. So yeah, I'll open it up for questions and
Yep.
people, and we have a big crowd on Zoom. So if you're on Zoom and you have a question, please feel free to raise your hand to ask a question. Yeah. Yep.
Yes, Yuri Anichenko, coordinating committee to Ukraine. I wanted to see in your interviews, what was the view of the difference between Russian Federation and Ukraine in that time? Something stands in your mind. And I guess number two question is, when you listen to Ukrainian people now, they talk about joining the civilized world.
Mhm.
And Germany is part of the civilized world in mind of the Ukrainians right now, because they follow certain rules.
Mhm.
And presumably the same path can be open to Russia if it follows the same rules at some point.
Mhm.
If you can maybe comment on the steps that
Right.
can be taken to achieve that. Thank you.
Okay, well, big topics. First of all, almost all of my interviews were completed before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And if you asked everyone I interviewed, no one believed that Russia would invade Ukraine. So it was not really a subject of that kind of conversation, you know. And you know, again, because of the limits I had, I focused really on the Russian Federation, not on Ukraine or Central Asia or Georgia. Even though many of these people, you know, cross those borders because the ties between them are still very strong, for instance, Soviet past. So based on my interviews, I can't answer your question about whether Russia is going to join the rules-based European order. I can only give you my opinion, which is it isn't. That this alliance with China, the continuing description of the world as being changed, and as the rhetoric about opposing Western values and institutions, I'm highly skeptical that it's going to go back to normal. I think that's not a good way for us to look at the future by thinking that it's going to go back to the past, because I don't think it will. But that's my personal opinion. You know, as to how that sorts itself out into an end of this war is beyond what I know, and it's beyond what I have here. And so I think that's something that's of great importance for all of us. But I can't speak to it.
Following up on the first question and your answer to this, you mentioned how that so many of these people travel between the post-Soviet countries all the time, and and with your limitation on Russia, you interviewed many of them who were not maybe Russian citizens, or
Yeah.
maybe not weren't born there, like Boris Jordan. I was wondering whether you categorize as Russian people from the 90s, someone like Alexander Melamud, who was born in Moldavia, has Russian and Israeli passport, but he lives in Ukraine, and he is still, I think, on the list of like 100 richest people of Ukraine. Like, are these people considered?
I interviewed mostly Americans.
Right.
Okay, so I did not, Ruben, blanking on his last name, the founder of Troika Dialogue, who was recently arrested in Nagorno-Karabakh, was one of my interviews, but he was an exception. I interviewed only a couple of, a woman who was part of Perestroika, the joint venture, a Russian woman, and some guys who were part of Troika Dialogue, but the original idea for the book was to see how Russians and Americans differed and how they saw this. But I didn't interview them,
Right.
so I can't speak to it. So, you know, I want to be, I want to not stray into sort of opinion land, and, you know, because I want to base it on what I actually know and then was conveyed to me. So I'm sorry, but go ahead. What was your, where are you going with the question?
Were these Americans that you interviewed mostly like were some heritage of like post-Soviet space, or they never had any linkage?
They were all over the place.
I see.
I think that there was an important impact of Russian Americans who came from the Civil War period. So like Boris Jordan's family was, you know, important politically and fled. And Peter Derby, who was the founder of Troika and Troika Dialogue, was the same background. And there were some others who I didn't interview who also were from that background. So they spoke Russian, they had cultural familiarity, they had some recognition when they came back to the country that they were not, you know, nasz человек, right? That were our people. And so that was important.
Are there some of the people that you interviewed who are still in Moscow, or all of them?
They were all over.
Russia?
I interviewed a lot of people from the Far East, from Vladivostok, and who were active in the Far East, and there were some from St. Petersburg and Moscow, and you know, yeah, mostly, and one an American from Krasnodar. So it was diverse.
Is that group still in Russia, or
Almost all of them are out.
they're all out?
Yeah,
That's the question.
they're almost all out. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question going back about the 90s.
Yeah.
And situating it, because I'm a political scientist, but I took history courses when I was in college and stuff like that. And obviously this like East versus West tension, this is like a big thing you get out of studying Russian history.
Yeah.
And my takeaway from your talk was this idea that, you know, the 90s had been this big moment of Western influence.
Mm-hmm.
And now in the 2020s, we're in this moment of like minimizing Western influence completely. Right. And I'm wondering how much I should take that away for the talk, because you're sort of, part of you gave this sort of subtext of the 2020s of saying, look, there's not McDonald's, but there's still McDonald's-esque, you know, there's a lot of these other things. But what I want to ask you about is in the 90s, right? Because I remember being on trains and talking to people in the 90s, and people were, you know, like terrified that the Chinese were going to take over the country, right? Because of demographic concerns, and that we were going to wake up one day and the eastern part of the country was going to be all Chinese. Yeah. And so my question was, is in the 90s, was it really as enthusiastic about the West as the portrayal is, and was the sort of Eastern influence as missing in the 1990s as you're saying it is present today? Like, so like, were people, I mean, just to be very simplistic about it, like you bring up sushi, right? Like sushi is not, I mean, yes, that could come from the West, but that's also, you know, of an Eastern influence. Was there looking to the East going on in the 90s at all, or was it a complete rejection of this idea that like Russia's future, if you were in Moscow in the 90s, lay in the West, and it was how you were going to Westernize Moscow, full stop?
Yeah, I think that 90% the West. I mean, sushi came from an American who created the Planet Sushi restaurant chain. It was the same American who created Rostiks and the fried chicken, Russian fried chicken, and who brought Caesar salad to Russia. Same guy, Henrik.
So then what's if that's your answer, that it was all about the West?
Yeah,
could you say
one more thing to add is look at the TV shows. Did you watch TV in those period of time? Santa Barbara was one of the most watched TV shows. Dallas, Santa Barbara, and of course there were the Mexican soaps, but there was a romanticism about America that was like unmatched. I mean, I'm talking on Russian friends in their houses. It wasn't, we were, you know, watching Santa Barbara on TV.
So then what's your explanation for how 20 years later, essentially, we can be so far into this anti-Western sentiment? Is that because of geopolitical events that took place in the intervening time? Is that something we put solely at the decision of directions Putin has gone? Is it overstated? Do you think that sort of pro-Western, I want to watch Santa Barbara and eat sushi is still there,
Yeah.
but it's repression and it's sort of too dangerous? Like, what's your explanation for if that was so enthusiastically pro-West in the 90s?
So I think that period lasted until 1998. 1998 was the financial crisis. And it brought down this sort of consensus about the West. And so in 1998, by 1998, the Russians had been sending people abroad to go to school. They've been working in institutions. 1998 comes, all the multinationals send half their staff home. The expat community crashes, and Russian companies discover that they can hire Russians. And international companies discover they can hire Russians who can do the same job, but don't require expat pay packages and extra benefits and all that. So at the same time, there was the beginning, and a phrase I use, and I remember hearing it, is stop telling us how to live. There was the recovery of Russia that had gone on through the 90s, and a sense that Americans never got it, that you shouldn't keep telling us how to live. We Russians weren't junior partners. We are sophisticated people of a world power. You don't get it. Stop telling us how to live. And there was, you know, you remember the movie Brat?
I know.
Yeah. Well, that movie to me was a symbol of some of that change that went on. I mean, and you know, the story of that is these Afghan war veterans, he goes to rescue either his sister or the sister of a friend in America who's been sold into prostitution in Chicago, and he just busts up all these Americans, and all the Americans in it are gangsters and poor and all this, you know, and I remember one line, and there was like, said to him, to the hero, it's like, who are you? Are you a gangster? And he said, no, we are Russians. And this moment of like cultural pride sort of began then by the early 2000s, and particularly it was that, okay, we want to participate in the international economy as equals. We don't want to be the students anymore. And we want to be treated differently than you've been treating us. And that, you know, then there was still this infatuation with Silicon Valley and learning from the West and the technology changes, but it soured over this period, partly for political reasons, but partly because, and I don't want to blame Americans, but we didn't quite get it. The period of tutelage passed, and the window to the West began to close in 1998. And it was a new period. And it was a period in which neither side adjusted very well to the other. Does that answer your question? Or?
Yeah, no. That's super helpful.
Yeah.
That's super helpful. That's exactly what I was trying. I was just kind of curious on your take on it.
Yeah.
Anyone else have a question?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I'll come back with the third question.
Yeah.
Does destruction of Russian parliament in '93 figure in any of the memoirs, and how did
it is.
How did people view it, and maybe some lessons we can learn from that?
Really good point. A good point. So it was in the memoirs, and it was in people's memories, and you know, the thing is, well, Yeltsin, as you know, the Supreme Soviet had been the holdover institution, but it was the only elected institution. And it refused to enact the reforms that Yeltsin wanted, and there was a standoff, and Yeltsin sent the army in and shelled the White House and disbanded the Supreme Soviet. I actually landed in Moscow on that day. I was watching that assault on the White House on TV at Sheremetyevo. Went down there the next day, and many of the people that I interviewed were there and talked about it. I think the consensus of people I interviewed was it was illegal, what Yeltsin did, but that they made a calculus in their minds that it was needed to be done, that the reforms were more important than the institutional niceties. Now, you know, you other people may have opinions about that. I saw no real evidence that Yeltsin was believed in democracy, that he really paid any attention to creating democratic institutions. He believed in the market. He believed in destroying socialism, but it was a appropriation of the sort of state property by private owners. But there was no similar effort in making democratic institutions, and so I don't consider him really a Democrat, but he certainly was an important sort of reformer, if you want to put it that way. And that's what 1993 was about. If you get in the way, we'll, you know, sila yes, ni nada, you know? So, yeah, just.
Yeah, yeah.
I was wondering if you could speak up to like the beginning of the 1990s, like in your experience there, to what extent do you think the more broader, I guess, geopolitical or international relations were shaped by views of how the Cold War ended? Like, was it because there's this idea that, okay, well, it ended because the economic system failed and there was no, and then there's other opinions of like, well, it ended because we voluntarily dissolved the Soviet Union so that we could work with the West to create more, and that opinion kind of a decade later might support the opinion like, okay, well, I guess we're not going to be able to work together as equals because we're not, because the reality is that, you know, 1990s US is unipolar economically, militarily. So I was wondering if you can speak more broadly as to like the position of Russia or former Soviet Union, Ukraine as well during that time period.
Yeah, well, so first of all, again, you know, the interviews in the book don't necessarily shed a lot of light on that question. I think what is clear is that it was a top-down decision to dissolve the Soviet Union, and that for whatever reason, the Communist Party had become weak and unable or unwilling to oppose that. And when Yeltsin and his counterparts from Belarus and Ukraine met in the hunting lodge in Belarus and decided to dissolve the Soviet Union, there's a podcast series that was done, I think, by someone out of Harvard, that the FSB was in the woods around that hunting lodge and never received an order to disband the meeting, and that Gorbachev, who had been in China at the time of Tiananmen Square, at the very moment when it was there, had committed to never using force against Russian people. And so I don't know that's why he didn't give the order to do it, but he didn't. And they, the three, and Ukraine had already voted for its independence by that time. Belarus, I don't think ever did. But they took the decision to disband it, the Soviet Union, Yeltsin apparently was drunk, passed out, woke up. The first call he made was not to Moscow, but was to Bush in the White House, and who he'd become friends with. There's a lot there to be unpacked. I think that the Chinese Communist Party has studied this. I would be interested to see if you want to look at what they think, but I think they think that the institution of the Soviet Communist Party had decayed to the point where they couldn't oppose this sort of dissatisfaction with life in the Soviet Union in the sense of falling behind the West. But I don't think there's a definitive answer. I think that's an interesting problem to unravel.
I look at more like what was going on in Southeastern Europe during that time. Was there some, I guess, anxiety of going back to that kind of, going back to, let's say, life before the 1990s, but in an even less stable work, like as when it falls in the former Yugoslavia or other countries, like this idea that, okay, we've entered into this, we're accepting the new reality, but we might end up being into the new millennium, living off worse than we were like 2 decades ago. Just broader public attitude.
Well, again, public attitudes didn't matter.
Yeah.
First of all, in the Soviet republics, there were movements for independence that were very strong and active at that moment. For the Russians, the general public, it was the Great Depression. It was a horrible time, and they did not benefit from it. And they don't look back on it fondly. It was a time of decay, of poverty, and I remember, being in Moscow, and there'd be the old people standing on the steps to the metro with a towel spread out, and they were selling a light bulb or a spoon or a cup, any of their possessions that they could possibly sell. And we Americans, and we were like, oh, this is great. This is historic transformation. We didn't even see it and paid much attention to it. But they experienced that period much differently than we did. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Okay, we have one other question from folks on Zoom, which is one person asking you to look to the future, and if the Ukraine crisis the war is resolved, and the person does not specify the manner in which it was resolved.
Yeah.
But I think the question is, what opportunities do you see opening if that war, I mean, the war eventually will come to an end. If that war comes to an end, do you haven't said, you've said a lot about the past, but haven't said as much about the future. So
yeah,
do you have thoughts on that, or is it too much uncertainty to be able to?
I think it's too much uncertainty. I think the relationship with Russia and China is becoming closer in the sense that they are in opposition to Western values and institutions is becoming stronger, and I would expect that to continue. I think one thing to look back on the period of citizen diplomacy is that the kinds of contacts or cracks or is unpredictable. It doesn't necessarily occur in official circles. So, no one could predict that an interest in human potential would result in a broadening exchange between people of the two countries. And I think that's, in the current circumstance, it's both that, it's what is going to be the influence of this very large Russian diaspora outside the country, and will there be a swing more towards sort of Western cultural values or not? These are big open questions that the intelligentsia, I think, remains interested in European and American sort of values and ways of life, but how strong that will be, or whether they've all left the country, you know, that these are unknowns that need to be looked at, I think, as part of trying to understand what may be possible.
All right, well, I think that's a good note to end on as any. So please, everybody join me in thanking Daniel one more time for sharing all of this with.